Welcome, everyone, to the second day of our seminar on modern challenges to liberty. We are joined this afternoon by Professor Mark LeBar, who is professor of philosophy at Florida State University. He works in moral, social, and political philosophy. His book, The Value of Living Well, is a development of contemporary eudaemonist virtue ethical theory, and he's now working on extending that account to questions about the nature and origin of justice. In fact, he edited a collection called Justice. It's also from Oxford University Press, and he's co-edited a volume called Equality and Public Policy from Cambridge. Mark is the editor of Social Theory and Practice and has published widely in journals including Ethics, American Philosophical Quarterly, and Philosophical Studies, to name just a few. The title of his first of two lectures this afternoon, and I want to note that he's giving 4 at this seminar, is titled Conceptions of Equality, Some Problems. Professor LeBar?
Thanks, Jason. I want to begin by thanking IHS for conducting this seminar and giving me an opportunity to talk to you all about it, and thanking all of you for taking time out to watch. I hope that what I have to say is useful to you, and I will certainly look forward to questions, issues, and so on that you want to raise either in this question time for the lecture or in the social tonight. As Jason mentioned, I'm actually doing 4 lectures in this seminar, and if you look at the syllabus for the seminar, they may look like they are on disparate topics, and in some ways they are, but I think there's a foundation to all of them, and it actually starts with what I'm doing, ironically enough, in these 2 lectures. So I'm going to be talking about justice and talking about equality, but thinking about equality primarily for its connection to justice, which is where I've done quite a bit of work. So here is my starting point, intuitive starting point in thinking about equality. It's obviously a popular issue in discussion, academic and popular, and I think it's true that just about everybody loves equality in one form or another. The fact that there are lots of different ways in which we might be equal or might want to see each other as equal raises a real challenge, and that is we have to decide which of these forms of equality really deserves our allegiance. Which should we really care about as a moral and social value? This is not a new question. Equality has been deeply tied to justice for a long time, at least since Aristotle. And so the way that I think about thinking about equality is one way of thinking about justice, and as it turns out, I think quite an important way. So my aim over the course of these 2 lectures is to take some steps towards sorting out worthy from unworthy forms or conceptions of justice, conceptions of equality, ways of thinking that we might be equal. I'm going to be focusing on philosophical work on equality for about the last 50 years, since the early 70s. There has been much more work on equality in this period than there was, I don't know, probably in all of Western philosophy before then. And that history has taken a trajectory that we might call a dialectical course. And by dialectic here, I mean argumentative pro and con. People offering a view, critics coming along, criticizing it, offering an alternative, criticism returning to that, and views developing through that kind of engagement with opponents. So to a great extent, what I'm going to be talking about in this session and next represents the work of egalitarians who are arguing with other egalitarians. So I will introduce more sort of my own critical point at various points, but a lot of this is not original to me. So I'm going to survey that history. As I sort of boil it down, 2 major forms of egalitarianism have developed sustained support. And by sustained support, I mean not just 1 or 2 people offering arguments for it, but a sustained research program with multiple participants, levels of going to and fro in arguments, responses, and so forth. One is what has come to be known as luck egalitarianism, and the other, what is sometimes known as democratic egalitarianism. I'll be talking more about the second of those in the second lecture. What I'm intending to do is consider some arguments for and against each, try to capture, most importantly, I think, what motivates people to defend these forms of egalitarianism. Each of them thinks that they're drawing on some pretty deep intuitive fonts, very strong feelings about equality that people have. And I actually think they're all right about that. One big issue is that our feelings about equality, our ideas about it, don't cohere very well. So we have to do some sorting. But in the end, I'm going to argue that neither is really satisfactory as a social ideal or as a conception of justice. And we need a third, at least a third. I'm offering a third, maybe a fourth will be necessary, who knows, but at least a third conception of equality as what really has claimed our endorsement and as the form of equality that we ought to see as really holding the moral high ground as against other conceptions. But I actually don't want to start with the philosophy. I want to start with a comment, because I've been doing versions of this lecture for some time now. And one thing that is really surprising is the gap between what philosophers are doing in discussing equality and most popular discussions of equality. And by popular discussions, I include their academic discussions in other fields, such as economics. So those discussions, whether it's in popular press or economists or whatnot, very often focus on equality of wealth or equality of income. Perhaps surprisingly, those forms of equality have no place at all in careful philosophical discussions of equality. I mean, nobody defends that I know of, defends equality of wealth or income. And that's really surprising, that philosophers would be that out of step with ordinary discourse. That does happen from time to time, and in lots of cases where that occurs, the explanation for that is that the philosophers are clueless goobs. I mean, they just have no idea what they're doing, or they've walked off in directions that no sane person should really be walking off in. I don't think that's the case here. I think there are multiple, perhaps, explanations for why this gap exists, but I think some of them amount to serious problems with thinking of wealth or income as forms of equality that we should care about. And those criticisms appear, or at least are implied, in some of the arguments of the egalitarians that we'll consider. I want to sort of step back to what I take to be implicit in lots of them, which is such a basic and powerful objection that I think philosophers may not take it up because it's so obvious that it is a problem, and it's a fatal problem. So I want to get to that point by inviting you to participate in a little thought experiment. It's going to be a comparison of societies. So these are toy societies. You can imagine either that these are societies of 4 people, or a society with 4 different groups, income groups, or wealth groups if you're more interested in wealth inequality. And you look at these 2 societies. In society A, the distribution looks as it does here. Society B, it's perfectly equal. If equality is your metric for social justice and for what we really should prefer to see in our societies, then society B looks pretty good. Society B is more just, and it is the society that is to be preferred on those grounds. But if you consider a third society, society C, on which the distribution looks as it does here, you have a problem, which is that, again, if equality is the measure or the criterion for justice, and justice is the first virtue of societies, as has been said, then society B wins again. And society B wins despite the fact that every single person in society C is better off than every single person in society B. Intuitively, that should strike you as a problem, that you have that you're valorizing a conception of equality on which every single person is worse off than they otherwise would be. So This little thought experiment demonstrates what's come to be known as the leveling down objection. The leveling down objection is grounded in the fact that we know how to make people equal in wealth and income. It's really easy. You just make everybody equally miserable. Human beings are really good at making other human beings miserable, and there's no great challenge in reducing inequality in that way. The problem is that that's just a horrific moral metric. These are forms of equality that don't really have anything to do with human welfare or with human beings living good lives. And as such, I think most people think, yeah, those are absolutely repugnant. So the problem of leveling down applies in spades to equality of income and equality of wealth. And I think what it shows all by itself, and it shows it pretty conclusively, is that those are irrelevant moral metrics. We ought not to care at all about equality of wealth and equality of income. They might be signaling things that we might want to pay attention to, but the deep intuition that they draw on, I think, is that poverty is terrible. And you can agree that poverty is terrible, that it's something that we should be thinking about, that we ought to be trying to ameliorate, without thinking that equality of wealth and income has anything to do with that story. That's maybe one explanation. I'll mention another a little bit as we go. So the philosophical story itself begins with John Rawls. And if any of you have done any philosophy and actually read in other disciplines, you may well have encountered Rawls. If you haven't, you should. Rawls' work is a wonderful piece of social and political philosophy. The magnum opus is A Theory of Justice, which was published in 1971. He had work on justice before then, but this is really the magnum opus that almost single-handedly brought into philosophical discourse intensive work on equality. It's been influential in a wide variety of disciplines apart from philosophy, social sciences, law, other disciplines as well, hugely influential, medicine. So, and one measure of the significance of his influence is that even those who disagree with him, and in some cases disagree with him very sharply, sort of start their presentation by saying, nah, here's what Rawls said, here's what he got wrong, here's what I'm going to fix, or here's how I'm going to fix it. So Rawls' discussion has sort of ended up being a North Star for much philosophical treatment, both of social justice and of equality over the last 50 years. So I want to start with what I think motivates Rawls. You won't find this in Rawls, but I think you will find the ideas there, and you'll find them driving his story. So this is a little story that I'm calling A Tale of Two Children. The young woman on the left, you may or may not recognize, is Jennifer Gates. She is the daughter of Bill and Melinda Gates, who are two of the wealthiest people in the world. They were wealthy before she was born. They were wealthy when she was born. So she was born into a very wealthy family. And I think we're fair in assuming that she has had pretty much every privilege that money can buy. And I don't say this in a disparaging way or a critical way. That's just the reality that she has been blessed by being fortunate enough to be born into an extraordinarily wealthy family. On the right is a picture. I don't know who these people are. The picture was taken in Manila, which has some acute poverty. I want to focus on the boy here, young boy. Don't know his name. I'm going to call him Philip because it's Philippines, I guess. I don't know if you can tell from the photograph at the resolution it is there, but they are walking in front of a, looks like an unused concrete sewage or drain pipe that's maybe 5 feet in diameter, 6 feet in diameter. And people are using that as a home. There's a whole bunch of these pictures, you can find them really readily, of people appropriating these empty pipes to use as homes. So without knowing a great deal more about Philip's circumstances, I think we're justified in thinking if these people have to make their home in a concrete drain pipe, things are really bad for them. And probably Philip struggles with adequate nutrition, adequate caloric intake. likely will have difficulty getting educated or taking advantage of it in virtue of some of the early nutritional deprivation. It's hard to know the story without knowing the details, but one thing is really clear. His life prospects don't look anything like Jennifer Gates's prospects. And so that kind of contrast, I think, is at the bottom of Rawls's fundamental intuition that the prospects of the lives of these two children are radically unequal. And second important point, neither of them has done anything to earn or merit the outlooks that they have. So Rawls calls the natural processes that bring about these great differences in fortune the natural lottery. And what Rawls insists is that the outcomes of the lottery are neither just nor unjust. It's not either just nor unjust that some are born fast, some are born slow, some smart, some not so smart, some beautiful, some ugly. That's just the natural lottery, and there is radical inequality there. That in itself isn't a problem of justice. What is a problem of justice is what we do about those inequalities. And that's really, for Rawls, the topic of justice. That's what a theory of justice needs to address. So Rawls's account attempts to explain how to arrive at principles of justice. That is, principles that, if society is governed by them, will be a just society. That's part of his program. And then another part is explaining what principles he thinks we would arrive at if we adopt the method that he advocates. So what is that method? Well, the first point is that Rawls isn't giving a thorough recipe for all aspects of society. His theory is about the principles that we should use to govern what he calls the basic structure of society. So the basic structure of society is the institutions that have the greatest impact on people's lives over the largest extent of those lives. And this is a diverse collection of institutions. Probably in the first instance, they would apply to the constitution of the society and the kinds of laws that society has. But it's not just political and legal institutions that are part of the basic structure, but other really fundamental social structures as well. Education, the way that education is provided, forms of social organization. So the family is an important part of the basic structure, and so forth and so on. This doesn't have to be a precisely bounded set, but you get the idea if we're concerned, if you grasp that we're interested in the institutions that have the biggest impact on people's lives and governing them by the appropriate principles of justice. So in thinking about what principles should do this, have this kind of governing authority, Rawls says we should think of ourselves as being behind a veil of ignorance. And that is, we don't want to put our thumbs on the scales in choosing those principles so that it conveniently comes out that we end up benefiting. So instead, we're to imagine that we don't know who in society we are. If we had a society that included Jennifer and Philip, we wouldn't know which of those two people we would be. So that would prevent us from tilting the balance to favor Jennifer, say, at Philip's expense. If we might be Philip, we might be more interested in making sure that Philip doesn't get a completely raw deal, no matter what happens. So then the question is, what principles would we end up with if we thought about principles of justice in the vein that Rawls suggests that we do? Well, he suggests that we would choose two principles. The first is a principle of equal liberty, and that includes liberal freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, those sorts of things, and also political liberties, freedom to vote, freedom to hold office, and whatnot. So that's the first principle, and Rawls stresses that that's sacrosanct. We can't make any compromises in the first principle in order to realize the aims of the second principle. The second principle actually has two parts. The first is what he calls fair equality of opportunity, which is something more than formal equality of opportunity. Formal equality of opportunity holds if we're not discriminating on arbitrary basis of race and sex and religion and so on. But Rawls thinks more than that is needed because people come from backgrounds that give them various advantages in competing for positions and offices, and we need to offset those advantages so as to have, so to speak, an equal starting gate for people applying for those positions in society. So that's fair equality of opportunity. The second is what's come to be known as the difference principle. And here his idea is that inequalities in what he calls primary goods, which we think of as the goods that make human lives good lives, from wealth or access to land or access to resources, what have you, those inequalities are tolerated only to the extent that the least well-off members of society are made as well-off as they possibly can be. So notice that that provision means that Rawls is not leveling down. If we go back and look at our Tory societies, the inequalities in society C arguably are defensible, at least prima facie, because everyone, including those that are worst off in society, are better off than they would be by imposing the kind of equality imposed in society B. Now, it's a quick and dirty argument. There might worry whether there are other alternatives that could do a better job than society C. Fair enough. Those are the questions that Rawls would have us be asking. So in different ways, Rawls has been the prompt for both major developments of egalitarianism since his work, and that's luck egalitarianism, as I mentioned, and democratic, sometimes called relational egalitarianism. And we'll see that as we go through them. We'll see responses to Rawls. So taking luck egalitarianism first, since Rawls' view really arguably is a view about inequality rather than equality, one response from egalitarians was that something had gone wrong right at that point. And the first major theoretical development in response to Rawls was what's come to be known as luck egalitarianism. And the first proponent of this, still, I would say one of the major architects, is Ronald Dworkin, who's a legal scholar. And you can find this in his book, Sovereign Virtue, which was published in 2000. But a lot of the theory there draws from papers that he wrote in 1981. So it was an early line of response to Rawls' view. So Dworkin's response to Rawls is that Rawls is sufficiently attentive to responsibility and desert. It ignores, in particular, ignores the degree to which we're responsible for the quality of lives we lead. So this is an artifact of Rawls' mechanism for arriving at principles of justice because of a detail that I glossed over at the time. But when we put ourselves behind the veil of ignorance, we not only don't know what position in society we occupy, we also don't know what fundamental moral or religious principles we adhere to. And this makes sense if we're thinking that we want to screen people off from, say, thinking, well, it's okay if we have anti-Semitic principles because I'm not Jewish, or what have you. The problem is that the veil of ignorance screens us off from some widely and deeply felt moral convictions. And Dworkin makes the case that arguably those convictions are as cherished as our interest in equality is. So there's sort of too high a price to be paid for proceeding as Rawls does. His view just does not capture intuitions that luck egalitarians take to be widely shared. Basically, the idea is this, that if one's life is really good for reasons reflecting that one deserves it, then there's no injustice in that. And conversely, if one's life is bad for reasons one really is not responsible for, that you're just on the wrong side of some serious bad luck, as Philip is, then that's the concern of justice. Only some of those outcomes really matter. So to tell this story effectively, luck egalitarianism tells us to distinguish between two kinds of luck, two forms of luck. So the first is what Dworkin calls brute luck. And this is the kind of fortune, for better or worse, that we're exposed to without any responsibility for it. So the life prospects of Jennifer Gates and Philip are good examples of brute luck. Neither of them had any responsibility for the conditions that they were born into. They're just stuck with it. And that's brute luck. Option luck. Option luck is luck in things for which we are responsible. So imagine that you cash out all of your life savings and you take that to Vegas and you put it on one spin of the roulette wheel, and to much surprise, you don't hit it, your life savings is gone, you're now impoverished. That's not a form of destitution that on luck egalitarianism that society has an obligation of justice to rectify. That was your choice. Your impoverishment is your responsibility. And you, not society, are on the hook for dealing with that. So that's what the distinction between brute luck and option luck does for the luck egalitarian. Justice requires that society mitigate the effects of brute luck, but not option luck. So if you don't hit it, society doesn't owe you anything for that bad option luck. But Philip is entitled to the concern of justice from society because his bad fate is brute luck. And that's our business, that it is our business to try to rectify. So I agree. I think with the luck egalitarians here, that I think that there are powerful and widely shared moral intuitions here that Rawls' view is scant on. I suspect, this is pure sociological speculation here, I suspect that insensitivity to issues of responsibility and desert is another reason that egalitarian theorists are not interested in equality of wealth and income, because they too pay no attention whatsoever to questions of responsibility or desert for where one lands on those scales. And I think the luck egalitarians are exactly right that that's too high a price to pay for a theory of equality, and there are theories of equality that manage it better. So one strategy of Dworkin's form of luck egalitarianism is to try to increase people's responsibility of their fates, in effect by converting some forms of brute luck into option luck. Okay, that sounds miraculous, but it's not. How does that happen? Well, it happens via insurance. Insurance is a mechanism that we're all familiar with, and the genius of it from the standpoint of the luck egalitarian is that it actually does change brute luck into option luck. It changes what things that nobody has any responsibility for into things that we do have responsibility for. So the option of buying insurance creates option luck where brute luck was before. So imagine that there's some kind of disaster that you're worried about. Imagine you're worried about your house burning down. Well, gee, you can buy fire insurance. Maybe having lightning strike your house and starting a fire that burns it down, that would be bad brute luck. But here's the deal. Suppose that you can buy insurance against your house burning down. And if you buy that insurance and lightning strikes your house, you're still subject to that bit of brute luck, but you're insulated from the really bad effects by insurance. But what if you pass on the insurance? Well, now passing on the insurance was your choice. So now losing your house is no longer brute luck. It's option luck. It's not society's problem. It's yours that you passed on that option that was open to you that would ameliorate the threat of a really bad brute luck option. So bearing the costs of insuring ourselves gives us an incentive against imposing the costs of risky or bad decision-making onto other people. And Dworkin thinks that's something that we should be going for. We should not be shaping social norms in such a way as to make others bear the costs of our bad decision-making. And this way of treating brute luck does that. So people are actually incentivized to take responsibility for their own well-being. So I've been focusing on Dworkin's form of luck egalitarianism, but there's actually several different forms. And the biggest point of variance is what exactly it is that we need to be equalizing to control for luck. There are at least four major alternatives here. Resources, I'll say a bit more about this in just a moment. This is Dworkin's, and it's still a major model. Capacities, basically we can think of those as being abilities to capitalize on opportunities that we have in virtue of the resources or other good things that are available for us to act on in society. Subjective welfare. Subjective welfare is a matter of basically getting what you want, of having your preferences satisfied, which is a very common social science metric. Here, the issue is not so much do you get what somebody else thinks you should be getting in your life, but do you get what you yourself want? And then the last being objective well-being. I'm going to talk a little bit about that one briefly as well. Each of these has strengths and weaknesses. And when I mentioned that there was a big discourse or dialectic. A lot of that is dialectic, not just amongst egalitarians, but amongst luck egalitarians, arguing against one or another version of these forms of luck egalitarianism in virtue of advantages or its disadvantages or advantages that they see in other forms. So that's been a huge amount of the work that's gone on in work in luck egalitarianism over the last 30 or so years. So as I mentioned, resource egalitarianism is Dworkin's view. His proposal in particular is that each person is entitled to an equal share of resources. Resources doesn't track resources in the way we think about natural resources or something like that. It's much more general, and I think by design vague in Dworkin's account. It's something like the general means we have for making ourselves better off working around or coping with brute luck. So these include not only things that we would naturally think of as resources. You know, if you think of, say, what are the resources available to Jennifer Gates? Well, geez, millions and millions of dollars comes to mind, but owning property or other things, but also our capacity to be inventive. Sheer intelligence is a resource. Intelligent people are capable of doing things that people lacking that intelligence can't do. Abilities in lots and lots of other different domains represent resources that prepare those who have them to do better in life. So that includes each person's physical and mental powers. So these resources are really heterogeneous, which I think you can see the point of that idea just by asking about how you go about trying to equate intelligence and wealth. How are we supposed to equate them? Well, Dworkin's thought experiment, and I emphasize this is a thought experiment, not an advocacy of policy. It's a way of trying to get at the sort of the driving idea of resource luck egalitarianism, is to have an auction. And in this auction, we would be auctioning off bundles of resources. So where bundles contain different amounts of different kinds of resources, composed in such a way that nobody envies anybody else's bundle. So somebody may have the genius of Einstein, but get not very much by way of financial resources. Somebody that is going to be struggling with an IQ of 70, they might get much more by way of those kinds of resources. And so the idea is we auction those off in such a way that at the end of the day, those bundles are equalized by making sure that nobody envies anybody else's bundle. Everybody is happy with the bundle of resources that they have, at least in comparison with those that others have. So that's a way of taking into account all the resources that are available socially and allocating them in a way that those who are going to have to make use of them feel is fair in the sense of not being enviable. So that's equality of resources. That's what Dworkin's version of luck egalitarianism requires. Objective welfare luck egalitarianism has also received some very formidable defense. This is the version of luck egalitarianism defended by Dick Arneson, who's published quite a bit in this area and been very influential. So the idea of objective welfare luck egalitarianism is that it's objective in the sense that there are some goods that make us better off irrespective of our preferences. So on the one hand, you are better off if you have good health and if you have friends than if you don't. And that's true whether you want good health and friends or not. Your preferences aren't what makes those things good for you. It's what they do for you objectively that make those things good for you. And conversely, some preferences, some subjective attitudes don't make people better off, and society has no business giving them any attention whatsoever. So Hitler thought he'd be much better off with a Europe that was cleansed of Jews. That's a preference that, number one, wouldn't have made him better off, and number two, we have no business as a matter of justice or anything else giving any attention to whatsoever. So those kinds of considerations work in favor of an objective standard for what's to be equalized rather than a subjective standard for what's to be equalized. So because luck egalitarianism has all these variants, and they differ very significantly in detail, I'm not going to pursue questions that really take up those individual differences here. Instead, what I'm going to do, and I'm wrapping up this lecture, the next lecture, what I'll do is start with questions that are broader and deeper that go to what Luck egalitarianism as a framework of conceptions of equality, what they have in common, and challenge that as a matter of justice. So I'm hoping that although some of the issues that I raised will be more prominent in some versions of Luck egalitarianism than others, they show up in one form or another in pretty much all of them. So they're getting to something deep about Luck egalitarianism rather than any sort of idiosyncratic questions about one or the other. And with that, I will stop and open the floor to questions, Jason.
Okay, thank you, Professor LeBar. So we do have several good questions, and we will jump right into those. In your view, what is the point of equality?
I'll be saying more about, I think I will defer to the next lecture to answer that, because what I'm going to do in the second lecture is present a very brief but square-on answer to that question, and then I'll be developing what I take to be really important aspects of that over the third and fourth lectures. So just to drop the shoe, I'm going to say it's equality of moral authority. I'll talk more about that, but I think, so let me back up. Having said, that's what I think the moral ideal pertains to. There are other conditions under which we might care about other forms of equality, but I'm focusing now on the kind that's really associated with justice as a social ideal.
Why does the unfettered market process not satisfy Rawls's difference principle if it benefits all individuals within a society?
There are, that's a great question, because there are people who argue that it exactly does. I'm not sure whether, especially with the unfettered qualifier in there, I'm not, so Friedrich Hayek was an early sort of fan of Rawls's work. I'm not sure that Hayek grasped all of the implications that came to be exposed in the decades after its introduction, but I suspect that Hayek might have thought that actually the kind of classical liberal society that he was defending in Constitution of Liberty might actually have a pretty good shot at satisfying Rawls' criteria. The philosopher, or I guess political theorist, John Tomasi, wrote a book 7 or 8 years ago, maybe back to like 2011, called Free Market Fairness. And Tomasi's work, which I am very happy to recommend, makes exactly that case. That if you really want the world that Rawls is sketching a defense for, what you want is basically democratic conditions with strong protections for the kinds of institutions that allow for markets. So suffice it to say, I think Tomasi's view is a small minority view of those who read Rawls. There are many more who think that some form of sacrificing of markets. So Rawls himself didn't think that, notably. So he favored what he called property owning democracy. I think he was also critical of many major overt forms of socialism, but there's a lot of nuance as to what conditions best realize those. But I also think that's actually an outcome that Rawls would be very happy with, because now those kinds of questions are to a great extent empirical questions. Rawls is a philosopher. He is not, I mean, he has views about the empirical facts, but he's not claiming to be offering an account of the empirical facts. He's claiming to be offering a theory of the questions that we ought to be trying to get answers to in order to have a society that can count as just. And so if that means, boy, let's go off and look at the facts about what societies that are constituted in various different ways, how those actually perform according to the metrics that Rawls himself is recommending, I think Rawls thinks that's a huge win for his account, because we're using the right tools for thinking about the economic or other empirical facts.
So glad that you brought up John Tomasi. Love that book. He's my former advisor. So we actually have a question about this from two sides. I'm going to pull in a couple questions here. So on the one hand, could you say a little bit more about the views of folks like John Tomasi and Jerry Gauss in using Rawlsian principles to classical liberal ends? And then also, what do you think about Jerry Cohen's critique of Rawls?
Good. So Cohen is a luck egalitarian. And at one point, I actually thought of trying to adumbrate or sketch out luck egalitarianism as he does. In the end, I didn't do that. And not having gone back and revisited those details really recently, I don't have a whole lot to say. His view is not the kind of resource egalitarianism. Well, I think it's distinct from both forms that I presented. But I think he fits pretty squarely into the luck egalitarian category. One of the major, at least rhetorical, if not philosophical thrusts of Cohen's work is the one that I began with as a reaction to Rawls, which is, holy smokes, people, this is a view that doesn't make equality central. It's a view that's concerned with providing excuses for inequalities. And if you really care about equality, it's very strange that you would have a view that in the end is saying, these are the conditions under which we can be happy with inequality. So, as I said, whether that's a rhetorical, or Cohen was a great rhetorician. Whether or not there's more philosophical force to that, I'm not the best to say. But that's where Cohen is. Cohen is mainstream in that reaction, that sort of luck egalitarian reaction to Rawls. As to people who think about Rawls' framework as providing a foundation for different kinds of views, I think ultimately, so I'm not an expert on Gauss. Gauss's form of justificatory liberalism shares with Rawls' view the idea that in some sense, each person in society is owed a kind of justification for the norms and rules and so forth that are imposed on them by society, and that has to be a justification that's acceptable to them, not in somebody else's light, and by somebody else's lights. And one way to think about the veil of ignorance is it's a special case of that kind of justification. I don't think that's the kind of justification in the end that Gauss himself thinks is most interesting, but there's a strong touch point at that point in that justification, that on Rawls' view, the justification for any principle that we want to seize on as being a requirement of justice has to be justified by us thinking about principles of justice from behind the veil of ignorance. And you mentioned another one that I forgot that you wanted a reaction to, Jason.
Oh, it was John Tomasi's.
Oh, Tomasi, yeah. So, and I'm not going to recall the specific argument that Tomasi's view is much more Rawlsian than Gauss's is. Tomasi accepts the rough framework of the two principles, accepts, I think, basically without qualification, the first principle, requiring liberal freedoms and political and democratic freedoms, but then argues that a society in which there are robust principles of private property ownership, contract, and so forth, the sort of suite of legal requirements that, at least in the Anglo-American tradition we've inherited, actually does pretty well by way of those two additional requirements. And in particular, it does well via the difference principle. That is, that society does a great job at making the least well off as they possibly can be, in this particular sense that if we try to make people more equal, we invariably will make people worse off. We will fail that leveling down test that I mentioned earlier.
So let's move from individual theorists to a few questions about sufficiency. Do you agree that when people complain about inequality, in many cases, what they are really concerned about is insufficiency?
Absolutely, yeah. So the point that I was making earlier about when I was sort of drawing to a close the brief remarks on popular discussions of equality, I mentioned that I think that poverty matters. And so one way of thinking about what I might have meant there is just taking that to be insufficiency. And I should say, so right, this is even more articulation of forms of luck egalitarianism. Arneson makes the point that you can have what have come to be known as sufficientarian or actually yet another variant is prioritarian variants of these positions, where you say, actually what matters is not so much that people be equal as that we do whatever we can to raise people to a certain threshold. And below that, the responsibility of society, at least as a matter of justice, is much diminished. Once they've gotten up to some kind of basic threshold, which probably is much nearer sort of the midpoint between us and Philip than it is between us and Jennifer Gates. Once they're there, it's like, okay, now there's a sense in which we can say you're sort of on your own. So you can see how a version of luck egalitarianism that treats that kind of sufficiency as being the currency would have both advantages and disadvantages relative to equality. If everybody was as well off as I am, I'm very, very well off compared with Philip. I am not well off at all compared with Jennifer. And you might think, you know what, even if everybody was doing as well as I am, there would still be huge problems with the inequalities between me and Jennifer Gates, right? Bill Gates can do stuff that none of us, even if they're doing as well as I can do. So equal egalitarians versus sufficiency egalitarians are going to point to that and say, yeah, you know, sufficiency matters in some ways, but there's other problems that it leaves untouched. The last form that I mentioned is prioritarianism, which just says the sort of burdens that we have socially as a matter of justice go first to, or the highest priorities are those who are worst off. And so actually it never is the case that there stops being social concern for the interests of its citizens. That's sort of the way that Dworkin frames these basic questions. That never stops. It's just a question of priority from those who are on the bottom rung to those at higher rungs. So all those versions that and more are out there as versions of luck egalitarianism, and that's a reason why I decided to try to step back and abstract from what I take to be our deeper problems with respect to their fundamental commitments.
So how would you think through a society where the upper quartile was sort of at the Gates level, and the bottom three quartiles were fairly well clustered above a point of sufficiency? So everybody has enough, but the richest are just far and away 2, 3, 10 times wealthier than everyone else.
Right. Oh, that's a great question. And I think it goes towards the interesting thing about, it actually goes towards a worry that I will that I mention now, which is that I think so thinking about those as stories about wealth or income, we skip past the basic question that luck egalitarians want to raise, which is, to what degree are people responsible for these fates? So if we just look at that graph, as I had that line chart, a bar chart, we don't know anything about how it is that people came to be in these positions. And I think there is no good answer to the question about how to think about that without knowing what that story is. So if the reason why the rich are so much better off than everybody else is that they have just expropriated massive amounts of wealth or income from the other three sections of society, that's not good at all. On the other hand, if they haven't, it's not clear, you know, if there's I think there's not really a problem. So I'd be inclined to think there might well be an injustice in that world that you're describing, Jason, of one quadrant doing much better than the other three. But if there's a problem of justice in particular, I think it's going to lie in the explanation of what they did to get that wealth. So in American society, we have some extremely wealthy people, and by my lights, some of them are justly wealthy, and some are not. So I myself don't have any problem. I guess Jeff Bezos is the wealthiest person in the world at this point. I don't know, maybe who knows what the stock market is doing today. I personally don't have any problem with Jeff Bezos' wealth. But on the other hand, there's tons of people in the financial sector that I think have gotten wealth basically by expropriating it from other people, by using the legal system to capture taxes or to avoid absorbing costs of risks. So the point that I made with respect to Dworkin's view about shifting risk from being brute luck to option luck by insurance, you can do it kind of the other way around if you get laws passed that insulate you from the downside of the risks you take and allow you to reap the benefits. Now it's just a matter of brute luck, and I think in the financial sector that's happened, and other sectors of the economy, that's happened to a sizable degree. So to the extent that that sort of fourth quartile is made up of people doing that, then I think there's a big problem. But again, it's not because of the disparity in wealth or income, it's because of the means that they used to arrive at those results. And so I think those charts by themselves and those figures by themselves tell us almost nothing. And I think the right thing to conclude about statistics that we hear about inequalities of wealth and income is this tells us almost nothing. Where we see big disparities, it might well be worthwhile looking into why those disparities exist. And in fact, I think that's the only way to do anything sensible and the only thing that really can have any moral significance to it. If we don't do that, the disparities themselves are meaningless.
What would it look like to begin investigating those disparities to see if they were just or unjust, especially related to questions around reparations for previous injustices?
The reparations question is an interesting one because I think it involves both dimensions. I think there's sort of a two-prong answer to your question. And I am not somebody who's worked on reparations at all, so I'm sort of flying by the seat of my pants here. It seems to me that thinking about that requires both normative or philosophical thought and also empirical thought. So the empirical thought of it, part of it, is obviously looking at and getting a good sense for who has suffered and how much have they suffered from whatever policies that it is that we think that reparations might be due for, slavery being an obvious case that we want to think about. The philosophical part of it has to do with thinking about when reparations are due. I don't think we have a good notion of reparations without a notion of restorative justice. And one real issue in restorative justice is who are the parties to questions about restorative justice? And do the burdens of justice extend to those who aren't the original parties? I'm not certain about that myself at all. So I remain to be shown that that reparations for slavery are an appropriate measure to deal with the unquestioned downstream effects of slavery that we still are suffering with.
Is it a matter of justice how the very rich spend their wealth, independent of questions of how they got it?
Great question again. I think yes. So, for example, one worry that egalitarians have typically about great inequalities of wealth is that those who have that kind of wealth are in position to leverage that wealth to get power over the people via the mechanisms of politics. So they can buy votes or they can buy policies. They can have influence that those who lack that have. And I think there's at least a prima facie case to be made that, yeah, it's unjust on the part of wealthy people to spend their money exerting those kinds of power. That kind of power seems illicit. I think both forms of relational equality that I'll talk about in the second lecture they will share the view that that kind of power is illicit. And so deploying resources to garner illicit power, yeah, that's really problematic. Buying stock and investing, Jeff Bezos, so the vast majority of Jeff Bezos' wealth is in Amazon equity. I guess now he owns the Washington Post and some other things. To the extent that Jeff Bezos is buying and investing in businesses, I think that seems not only not unjust, but actually really commendable. I don't think that charity is necessarily especially commendable in the wealthy. Might be, I don't know that it's any less commendable than in others. But people who have built wealth by creating institutions or investing in ways that have demonstrably made people not just better off, but significantly better off, as it seems to me that Bezos has. He's got an ability to make people better off that most people don't have. So I think, why would I wish for him to give money to somebody else that lacks that ability? I will like to see him exploit that capacity as much as he can, because in doing so, he's making that many more people better off in a way that other people aren't so good at.
On the example of Bezos, how should we think about Bezos's contribution to the well-being of consumers versus the well-being of his employees, given some of the concerns that folks have about working conditions at Amazon?
Good question. And that comes up because there's been some, at least maybe a lot, of criticism of Amazon's treatment of its employees. And I'm not in position to make many judgments about that. I don't know about the details, and I don't know how well-grounded they are. There's been enough of them that probably there are some issues. I don't think there's an easy recipe for comparing those. I think it's really easy in focusing on issues for employees to overlook the massive amount of consumer surplus for Amazon employees. The other thing is that a lot of that consumer surplus has gone to the least well-off. This argument may be more difficult to make, or at least more complicated to make, in the case of Amazon than it was a couple of decades ago about Walmart. People who have been around for 20 years will realize that the criticisms about Amazon now are the same criticisms that were raised about the tyranny of Walmart 20 years ago. It was a monster that was going to take over the world. That was before we knew what Amazon was. And of course, I think right now, we don't know what monster is going to eat Amazon, but Amazon will eventually have its lunch eaten by somebody else. That's the way these things go. But the consumer surplus for Walmart was staggering. And the vast, vast majority of consumer surplus of Walmart went to people that were at the lowest income echelons of society. So I think you have to look at details. There are certainly forms of treatment of employees that can be unjust, and those are just unjust, and we ought to criticize them, and they ought to correct them. There are others that may be more contentious, but I would think, what we don't want to do is kill off the goose that's laying the golden egg of consumer surplus that it's generating. Don't want to kill it off. If we can fix it, maybe.
So we have time for one more question. Are there any popular arguments which don't view equality as a matter of justice?
I don't know. So I take it, the answer is no. I don't know. If the question is, do I know of any, then the answer is no. I don't know of any really on either side. So when questions about inequality of wealth or income are raised in popular press, or even other academic contexts, it's almost always because inequality of wealth or income is taken to be a paramount, if not the paramount issue of social justice. Not always, right? So we now see criminal justice emerging, and sort of Black Lives Matter and racial justice as being of paramount importance. And that's not completely distinct from questions about income and wealth, but I take it that's almost always an issue about justice. And I think all of at least the major philosophical contributors to thinking about equality think they are interested in it because it's a matter of justice. It's a matter of just societies, or it's a matter of our living with one another justly. So I don't know of any. It's the long answer to the short answer that was no.